and as we were singing, praying, and we keep them with us all day long. Last night after the workshop, the introductory workshop, the introductory lesson sort of to our workshop, one of our brothers, Dave Rich, said to me, that was time well spent. And we have more time to spend well today, and a little bit more on Sunday morning, so we're all looking forward to that. We want to better understand those who've experienced the loss of a spouse. We want to understand better how to serve them, and we want to better also prepare ourselves for when we find ourselves in their shoes. My mother was a widow for 12 years before she died, and in her papers I found a little clipping that I'd like to read to you. It's just one paragraph. It says, the role of widowhood is perhaps the most difficult that a woman will have to accept. Of course, that would be true for a man as well. It carries with it the sad feeling of being separated from part of herself. When she was married, she became one flesh with her husband. When she becomes a widow, the source of love and understanding is severed, and she stands alone in a world where she no longer is first in the heart of anyone. My mother underlined those words, where she is no longer first in the heart of anyone. Certainly she is loved by her children and friends, but these have their own lives. They will include her in their love, but she no longer occupies the chief seat in anyone's life. While this feeling is desolate and painful, it will only prove fatal if fed by bitterness and self-pity. The death it produces does not affect the physical body, but the more vital spiritual life. To make this loneliness work together for good, quote unquote, is the primary task of the widow after the initial shock of death has passed. And she wrote at the bottom of this, this is one of my favorite explanations of how we feel. I'm going to repeat Dean Miller's bio right now that you heard last night. You'll hear it again tomorrow probably, so we're going to know this guy really well by the time he leaves, also from the good work that he is doing with us and the things that he's teaching. He was born and raised in Ohio, attended Freed-Hardeman University, graduated there with a degree in Bible in 1976, preached for 45 years for churches in Ohio and in Tennessee. Most of those years, 33 of those years, with the Hartfield Church of Christ in Hartfield, Ohio. He was married for 41 years. The couple had 3 daughters. They have 5 grandchildren. Dean's wife, Ruth Ann, was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 8.5 years before her death on Christmas morning 2013. That loss and the life experienced after it provided the motivation for what he's doing now, the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. He's done over 40 workshops now. If I understand, he might be doing some in California coming up here from some of the folks that are visiting this weekend. He's been in 14 different states doing this workshop, and he has written a couple of books, When the End Comes and Before the End Comes. I have to tell you that, like I told someone else a while ago, if you let him take his picture with you, you're going to be all over Facebook tomorrow. Just be ready for that. This morning we have 2 sessions, well 3, well this morning 2, Divine Perspective of Widowhood and Personal Perspective of Widowhood, and then after lunchtime, Marriage After Loss. So we will be breaking for lunch. Hope you have all signed up for lunch. If you haven't signed up for lunch, you have to wait in here while the rest of us go and eat. Unless you can talk Lori into letting you come in. It's all yours.
Cheryl Wayne, I want you to know that this morning on Bended Knee, I thank the Lord for you and for your help in the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. Some of the finest people I've ever met, some of the most inspiring people I've ever met, I've met because of this ministry. They are just inspirational. Cheryl Wayne knows about marriage and about the blessings that are attendant with that marriage. He also knows about his wife Kathy getting cancer and the struggle that was. And he knows about loss, and he knows about the struggle of trying to live a meaningful life after that loss. We met in an unusual way. I'd written an article in the Magnolia Messenger publication, which comes out of the state of Mississippi, about widowhood and about the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. I got a call on my phone after I was doing my walking that day, and it said Carthage, Missouri. I answered it because I knew one person from Carthage, Missouri, but it wasn't Cheryl Wayne LaHawn. The first words out of his mouth were, "Is this Dean Miller?" I said, "Yes." The second words out of his mouth was, "You have got guts to write that article in the Magnolia Messenger." That's how our relationship started. It was an article that basically tried to explain that this is a ministry that has fallen through the cracks in the brotherhood. This is something that we have not attended to like we really should have and could have. And I was a part of that neglect. For decades, I was a part of that neglect. And for the rest of my life, I am committed to raising awareness about widowhood and about the challenge of not just loss, but the greater challenge of living after the loss. The loss is hard, but living after that loss is way harder. Let me read to you a section out of a book called Widow's Might. It's one of the books out there on the display table. You know those books that you're not supposed to take that belong to me? Okay? You can buy the one book out there, but the display table is not for your taking. Widow's Might is the book. Here's how the author writes. If I could have one positive thing to come from Dale's death, it would be the ability to explain in words the utter, overwhelming sadness of the loss. One of the primary differences between the death of your spouse and the death of anyone else is that you have a level of physical intimacy with your spouse that you just don't have with other people. That, combined with the sheer amount of time that you spend together, heightens the loss. Until you've lived it, I'm not sure you can totally wrap your thoughts around the crushing magnitude of losing a beloved spouse. Even as a strong woman with a powerful faith walk, wonderful family, and large support group, I was brought to my knees by Dale's death. I've totally changed how I think about life, marriage, and myself. Whatever happens in my future, it will never be the same. Boy, there's an in-your-face description of the tremendous challenge that I was unaware of for decades in my life until it happened to me. I want to give you a little bit of introduction to the Widowhood Workshop Ministry and widowhood in general, and then we're going to get into emphasizing God's perspective about widowhood. Ruth Ann Reed was born in 1952 in Northeast Ohio, about an hour south of Cleveland, in a little town called Dover, Ohio. I met her at church, like I'd mentioned last night, and we were married for 41 years after we had hung out together, beginning at age 15 until age 19, and we took the plunge at 19. And a couple of hours after we got married, we got in the car and we headed back to Henderson, Tennessee, where I started my sophomore year of school. I don't know how in the world we survived those early years, but we did. It wasn't a perfect marriage. It was two imperfect people who were bound and determined not to give up on ourselves or the Lord who had joined us together. We were blessed with 3 children. All girls. Michelle lives in Middle Tennessee, Smyrna, Tennessee, between Nashville and Murfreesboro, and she is a corporate accountant for Bridgestone Firestone. And then our middle child is down in Gainesville, Florida. She's a doctor of physical therapy, her and her husband both, and they are members of the University City Church in Gainesville, Florida, and my son-in-law there is a deacon with the church. And then my youngest daughter, who you'll hear more about Sunday morning in our time that I get to preach at you. She lives in Villa Rica, Georgia, where I now live, about 40 miles west of Atlanta. There's no doubt but that they were raised right. If you look at the t-shirts in the lower right corner, God first, then family, then the Buckeyes, the Ohio State Buckeyes. I love to go to C-Bus. A few months after my wife passed away, this picture was taken where she was buried. We enjoyed those 5 grandchildren together for a brief time. Can you imagine laying in a hospital bed at home, and being so physically afflicted that when your youngest grandchild is put into that bed, you don't even have the ability to raise your arms and hug that child? I don't know what in the world was going on inside of her head and her heart during those last several months where she couldn't even speak. And it is so hard to caregive with someone who can't speak to you. You know, as much as I hate widowhood, and I hate it, what was, I think, to me, harder than widowhood was caregiving. I'll talk a little bit about that Sunday morning. There were times during that period of 8.5 years that I thought I was going to snap. It is a challenge to be a caregiver to somebody that you love dearly, that you can't stop from their deterioration. And all you can do is try to help. It's the most exhausting experience, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, that I could have ever experienced, I think, in my life. And having talked to other caregivers, I think that is a common feeling. She passed away on Christmas morning at 9:40 in the morning, 2013. Our oldest daughter was on her left, and I was on her right. We watched her breathe her last breath. Neurological diseases, like Parkinson's disease that she was afflicted with, don't get the publicity that cancer does. And I am not in any way belittling or dishonoring the struggle of being a cancer patient. There's a uniqueness about that cancer struggle, and there's also a uniqueness about neurological diseases. And with these neurological diseases that create this slope downward, it is agonizing to watch them lose their ability to function and then become somebody who's totally dependent, literally totally dependent on somebody else. What we're going to talk about is the state of one who has lost their marriage by death. It's not the only way that you can lose your marriage. Some people suffer the loss of their marriage by divorce. And there are a lot of things that I'm going to say, especially in that second session this morning, that are as applicable to those who have been through the agony of divorce as those of us who have lost our mate and our marriage by virtue of death. Both of them are a tremendous challenge. In the Western world, we are a minority almost everywhere, about 6% of the population typically. And notice, though, that when you get into a certain demographic, kind of a targeted research, what you find is 65 years and older, that's 1/3 of the population. The average age of a woman when she is first widowed in this country, let me ask you this question. If you were to guess a decade where this percentage is, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. When you think about people losing their mates, what decade do you think about in a person's life? Anybody? 70? Okay. 60? Okay. Have you known people in their 80s that have lost their mates? 90s? As the age gets older and older, we anticipate the greater likelihood of losing our mate. The average age of a woman in our country, now I'm talking about the average, not the median, the average age of a woman when she's first widowed in this country is 57. Now, when you think about the boatload of people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s who lose their mate, you have got to have a boatload of younger people losing their mates to drive that average number way down to 57. I remember Denny Hickerson was sitting back in that direction in the auditorium in Medina, Ohio, when I was doing my second widowhood workshop. And I said, okay, let's think about some things that you would commonly relate to widowhood. And Denny raised his hand back there. And I said, okay, Denny, what do you think is something commonly related to widowhood? He said, old age. Well, I'm here to tell you that there are a lot of younger adults who are widowed. Probably the most inspiring people I've ever met are the young women that I've met since I started this ministry in their 20s and 30s who lost their husbands because of an auto accident, suicide, heart attack. Can you imagine how Emily, as a faithful Christian, struggled at the age of 34 when she was awakened one morning by her 35-year-old husband having a heart attack? She attends to him in the best way that she can, gets 911 called. He's picked up and taken to the hospital and dies a few days later. She's 34 years old. He was 35. Can you imagine being the young lady who was a teacher in a faith-based school? And she called her husband every day at lunchtime. And this one day, she hangs up the phone with concern. She decides to get in her car and drive home and just leave her place of employment at the school. On the way that she's headed home, it was a 45-minute commute. She calls her dad, who was a law enforcement officer. And she said, Dad, please go to the house. I'm concerned about him. When her dad got to the house, he had taken his life. Buffy had a daughter or a son about a year and a half old at the time. And then there's Brittany, who in West Tennessee, her husband was driving in Trenton, Tennessee. And she's widowed after about 1,300 days of marriage. I know that because I've read her blog that she wrote in her grief journey after her loss. It can happen to any married couple, any married person, anytime. But obviously, the older you get, the more likely it becomes. 65 years and up, if you split the genders, 37% of the women 65 years and older are widowed. That's significantly over a third. 12% of the men over 65 are widowed. Drop that number down to 55 years and older, 32%, almost a third of the women 55 years and older are widowed, 9% of the men. Now you notice that there is a boatload of females and not nearly as many males who experience widowhood. There's two reasons for that, statistical evidence. One is the fault of the female gender and the other is not. The one that's not is they live longer. And I've always suspicioned, fellas, that the reason why women live longer is we treat them so good. We treat them so awesome that they just live longer. That's the only thing that to me explains their longevity as females. So they naturally live longer. Now, the thing that is their fault, statistically, most often, women marry men who are older than they are. When you put those two facts together, you're going to create a lot of females and not nearly as many males. 75% of all married females in our country, 75% of all females in our country who are married are going to be widowed. 75%. That's all Census Bureau statistics. 20 million is the number. It's been as low in the past in the neighborhood of 15 million, and it can get up near 20 million some years that we have in the United States of America. Now, if you broaden your perspective to the world, I forgot to mention this. 1.4 million join the ranks of the widowed under 44 years old. 78% of the widowed are female. Most research on widowhood has focused on women because widows outnumber widowers nearly 5-1. Some years, statistically, it's 4-1. Others, it's 5-1. It's estimated that half of all marriages end with the death of the husband. 1/5 end with the death of the wife. Widowed people are a minority, and that's what complicates life when you're trying to live after loss, because you've been forced into this club that nobody wants to be a part of. The widows are in a sorority that they didn't sign up for, and they don't want to be a part of, but they've been drug kicking and screaming into this sorority. Nobody wants to be in the widowed club. We don't make a choice to be in the widowed club. But so many women are going to be in that club. And then, like I said, there's not nearly as many men. We really need to talk more about this, even with our missionaries that we support. Can you imagine 245 million women? See, they don't even count the men. I mean, we don't count, guys. 245 million women in the world are widowed. Now, that comes from some research that Sherry Blair, remember Tony Blair, the UK? Okay, this is his wife, working in conjunction with the United Nations. They estimate in the neighborhood of 245 just women are widowed. Now, 115 million is in parentheses. Those are the ones that they calculate are living in abject poverty. Two countries lead the way in having a great number of widowed folks. We already referenced the United States, about 20 million. China has the most, over 40 million. India is a close second. They have over 40 million. So when we have missionaries in some of these places, are we encouraging them in their planting of the seed of Christianity in these countries? Are we encouraging them to minister to the widowed, especially in light of the fact that there's so many more in their country than there is in our country? Well, if we're not doing a very good job with that, how well do you think we are doing in regard to encouraging our missionaries to make sure that they include that aspect of Christianity in their planting of the seeds in some of these different countries? I want to ask you to look at these descriptions that God has in the Bible about himself. If God describes himself as a defender, a reliever, and protector of the widowed, what does that say about God and the widowed? Anybody? What did you say? He cares for them. They're important. Okay. Anybody else? They need help. Okay. Is he aware of what's going on in their lives? Oh, yes. Now, wait a minute. Let's make a distinction, though. Let's think about us. Have you ever been aware of somebody's uniquely difficult struggle, this very difficult phase that they're in life? Have you ever been aware of that and then really not done anything? I have. Am I the only one? You know, we're human beings and we miss the mark. Way too often we miss the mark. Sometimes we can be aware of somebody's unique struggle or difficult phase in their life, but we're not responsive. See, that's one thing like last night when we talked about Job and the story of Job. Those three guys, they were really great to drop everything going on in their life and then making the journey to go to Job. And even when his appearance was so weird that it didn't even look like him, they didn't back away. Again, they ran to the fire. They ran to the gunshot. And they sat there with that guy, their friend, for 7 days and didn't say a word. Now, if those were 3 females, it would have been a miracle. Okay, there's no way you could get 3 females sitting with somebody else and not speak for a week, okay? But these were males, they could do it. Now, they may have grunted, but, they didn't speak a word, okay? See, they were aware of what was going on with Job. Some way, somehow, they were aware. And then because they were aware, they expressed their care. God knows what's going on in the life of the widowed, in the heart of the widowed. And not only is he aware, but he cares. How does God do that, though? How does God care? How does he exercise that defense? How does he provide that relief? And how does he provide that protection? People. The person in the mirror. He has no hands, but whose hands? Our hands. You know the song? He has no feet, but our feet. It's God's people that ought to be doing his will in regard to the widowed. Wouldn't it be a neat thing if the churches of Christ worldwide became the church that's known as the compassionate church that dearly cares for the widowed? And all over the country, we have congregations of the Lord's church who are ministering to the widowed, not just in their church, but in their community. Psalm 94 and verse 6 says that the wicked slay the widow. In Job 22, one of the accusations made against Job, Job, you must have sent widows away empty. That was their explanation. The million-dollar question we ask is why? Okay, Job, you want to know why you're suffering the way you are? You've done some horrible things, and it's all coming back on you. And you surely must have, among all the terrible things you've done, you have had the audacity, you have been so callous, you have sent widows away empty. Now, of course, he hadn't. But isn't it interesting that you see those kind of expressions? Even in ancient times, it was recognized that human beings need to care for other human beings. And that's what we ought to do. Not take advantage of, but care for. In Deuteronomy 24, I think it's interesting, before they ever get into the land of Canaan, that God gives Moses instructions to give to the Israelites. Now they're going to cross the Jordan, and when they cross the Jordan, what are they going to end up eventually? What are they going to engage in when they get into the land of Canaan? What are they going to have to do? They're going to have to take it over. To take it over, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to push. We're talking about military endeavor. There's not mention of military exercise here. Here's what's interesting, is instead of talking about those military operations and taking over the land, look at what he talks to them about. Starting at verse 17. You shall not pervert justice due the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Did you notice the 3 classes of people that are mentioned here? Foreigners, who else? Orphans, and the widow. What is common of all 3 of those things? All three of those life circumstances, what's common about them? What? They're unique. Their need, okay. They're alone. They need help. It's a uniquely difficult life circumstance. And here, they're going to go into the land of Canaan. They're going to have to engage in battle eventually. But instead of talking about military strategy, God has Moses say, okay, this is the kind of people that I want you to be. This is how I want you to behave. And then notice how it closes. Even there in verse 21, when you gather the grapes in your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Now watch what is repeated again. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. Why does he bring up Egypt? He does it twice. Why does he bring up Egypt? Why does he say, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt? How does that relate to this command? They were oppressed in a very difficult life situation. When they were in a very bad situation, they cried out to God, didn't they? And they begged him for relief. Did God hear what they cried out to him about? Was he responsive? Yeah. Were they blessed beyond anything they deserved because God cared for them? God says to them, look, I've been compassionate to you. You've been blessed beyond measure and beyond merit. Now you be like that to people who are hurting. You were hurting. I heard you and I ministered to you. Now you be that way to others. Isn't it interesting that at this time, at this juncture in their history, he says, this is how I want you to be, and this is how I want you to behave. And of all the kinds of life circumstances that could be mentioned, he mentions these three that are, by the way, often, sometimes it's two of the three, sometimes all three are often mentioned together in Scripture because they are all three uniquely difficult life circumstances. Well, Israel was kind of like us. Just because we hear doesn't mean we really implement what we hear. In the book of Isaiah, I want to notice some things in the first chapter. In Isaiah chapter 1, here's God having a prophet of his talk to his people. He describes them in verse 4 as a sinful nation, root of evildoers and corrupters. Now again, remind you, these are the people of God, but they've fallen. They've spiritually fallen. They've not attended to their relationship with God. They've not embraced in heart and in mind the things that he wanted them to be and the things that he wanted them to do. As a matter of fact, in verse 10 of chapter 1, he refers to them as Sodom and Gomorrah, his own people. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the law of your God, you people of Gomorrah. What was the problem? Drop down to verse 12. When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand to trample my courts? Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons and the Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot endure iniquity and the sacred meeting. For your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates, and they are a trouble to me. I am weary of bearing them. You spread out your hands. I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. They were, well, let's make this contemporary. They were church-going folks. Sunday morning, they'd get cleaned up. They'd get their family together. They'd go to church. They'd even go to Bible study before worship. Never missed a Sunday. And if they had a Wednesday night service, they were there too. They were dropping some money in the plate. And they were checking boxes. You know, we need to be careful that rituals that have great value and tremendous power in our lives, that we don't let them become mere rituals. Every ritual has a purpose. Circumcision had a purpose. Israel missed it. God, yes, there was the physical element of the circumcision, but what God wanted them to understand in that circumcision was, you're mine. I'm yours. We have a covenant relationship. They missed the heart of the matter. They did the ritual, but they missed the purpose, the value of the ritual. We can do the same thing about church. They had done the same thing. Oh, they offered their sacrifices. They observed the festivals and the feasts. But God says, look, you're acting like Sodom and Gomorrah. You may be going to church, but what about Monday through Saturday? And what about the kind of people you are in your heart? You see, they needed to be washed. Look there at verse 16. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes and cease to do evil. Well, okay, what were they doing? Of all the things that he could specifically mention, now look at verse 17. Learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless. Look at the next phrase, the last phrase in that verse. Plead for the widows. Isn't that interesting? When he got to mentioning things of a specific nature, and he really targeted, notice the things that he would target. Notice there again is that mention of the fatherless and the mention of the widowed. Look at verse 21. How the faithful city has become a harlot. It was full of justice, righteousness lodged in it. But now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your wine mixed with water, your princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and follows after rewards. It reminds me of Washington, D.C. every time I read that passage. But notice what he says in verse 23. They do not defend the fatherless. There it is again. They do not defend the fatherless, nor does the cause of the widow come before them. It's like you read in Amos about how they couldn't be grieved for the affliction of Joseph. When we get to where we can't be touched, really moved by the affliction of people who are going through difficult times, God help us. God help us to repent. I confess for decades, even as a local preacher, I just didn't understand. I was ignorant and I was inexperienced, but I ain't no more. In Jesus' day, remember how he would sometimes indict the Jewish people, and especially the Jewish leaders, about them devouring widows' houses. I'll be really honest with you, I'm not sure what that means, except I know it ain't good. And that's pretty obvious. Instead of compassionately blessing these people with uniquely difficult life circumstances, they're not only neglecting them, they are taking advantage of them. In Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, I find it interesting, after you read about in the book of Acts, this thrilling story about this thriving church. You just have the gospel being taught, people being receptive, and thousands upon thousands of people becoming Christians, and the church is growing rapidly. We have a brother in the church, Brother Wayne Jackson, who's written a commentary on the book of Acts. And he makes a point of noting that based on what you're reading in the first 5 chapters of the book of Acts, that you could probably, at Acts chapter 6, imagine somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 Jewish people who are now members of the Lord's church. Now, if that's anywhere near true, if you have 20,000 people together as a group, do you know what you have? You have a lot more than 20,000 problems. Because you know what? All of us have baggage, invisible baggage. We got stuff. We got issues. We got struggles. Some of these things we don't talk about, and other people don't know about. But then maybe some of us share some of our struggles with others. But when you've got 20,000 people, I would not want to be a shepherd in that church of 20,000 people. I can't imagine. Now, do you honestly think at this mark, if it's anywhere near true in the neighborhood of 20,000, how many ministry weaknesses do you think there had to be in that group? That group of people many of whom had come from other places and come to this location not knowing what in the world they were going to experience, and now ending up being there a lot longer than they anticipated. Do you think there'd be some ministry issues in them caring for one another up to this point? But we don't have mention of those. But in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, what you read about is the first ministry weakness in the early church. Of all of the ministry weaknesses that could have been mentioned, it's this one. I'm sure you're familiar with it. In Acts chapter 6, verse 1, in those days, when the number of disciples was multiplied, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Did God, using his inspired apostles, permit that to linger, to go on, that neglect of the widowed people? Well, no. God made sure that that need was addressed. When we become aware of needs in people's lives, what we need to do as the body of Christ is do the best we can to assess what the need is and then try to effectively address the need. And in the church, that was done in Acts chapter 6. But of all the ministry weaknesses, it's this one specifically that's addressed. I think that's interesting, especially in light of everything you read about God's defensiveness about the widowed, his desire to be a protector of the widowed, and encouraging his people to do that. You know that James 1:27 passage. That James 1:27 passage is really worth reading. Brother Charles Hodge, who has now passed away, used to be famous for saying, familiar scriptures ought to be read more carefully. Boy, that's so right. We observe the Passover with a lot of passages because we've heard them a million times. No, let's stop for a minute now. Let's think about this. Look at James 1 and verse 27. What's the topic of this verse? What's the subject or the religion? Okay. Religion is, the English word religion, religere, is from the Latin and it means to tie back. It's about man being tied back to God. It's very similar, very akin to the concept of reconciliation, that word used in the Bible, where we're reconciling people at distance or at offense. Okay, now, this is about religion. Now, what kind of religion? Pure and undefiled religion. Now, that implies all religion is not equal. All religion is not equal. If there's pure and undefiled religion, what's the opposite of that? What's the opposite of pure? Unpure or impure. What's the opposite of undefiled? Defiled, okay? If there's pure and undefiled religion, then there's impure and defiled religion. Now, in whose mind, in whose perspective are we talking about? You know, people have, us human beings, we're kind of like dogs. We have notions like dogs have fleas, and about as many. We've got all kinds of notions about all kinds of things. Now, whose notion about pure and undefiled religion is this? God's. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this. Remember, what is wisdom? When we see something the way God sees something. Okay, now, this passage is critical. It's really fundamental. It's kind of like the theme passage of the book of James here. Now, in that passage, again, I'm going to take you back to the nightmare of English class. In that passage, there are two verbs. What are the two verbs? Visit and keep, okay? Now, verbs have objects. Is this a nightmare going back to English class? Okay, verbs have objects, okay? Let's do the second one first because that's the easy one. Keep, what's the object of keep? Keep yourself, or keep oneself. Keep yourself, okay? Keep yourself what? Unstained or unspotted from the world. I love Isaiah chapter 6, that vision that Isaiah had of the holy God. I cannot imagine what a thrill that must have been for him to have seen God sitting on the throne and then hearing those words, holy, holy, holy. And it made a tremendous impression on him. He was a sinful man. among sinful people. And he was impressed with his sinfulness when he appreciated more fully and completely the holiness of God. You know, when we really understand religion for what it ought to be, and we come to be more respectful and appreciative of the holiness of God, we have motivation, greater motivation, to keep ourselves unspotted from the unholy things of the world. I don't know how many times I've quoted that passage or heard it quoted with an emphasis on that very fact. Now, in the church, haven't we done a pretty good job? We've tried, I think, at least, to encourage ethics, divine ethics, God's sense of morality. Okay, now let's go to the first verb. The first verb, how many objects does the first verb have? Okay, the first verb, visit, has two objects. What are the two objects? Orphans and widows. Visit. Does anybody have a translation that might say care for? That is actually the concept of this word visit. Here is the word in the Greek language. It's a common verb. The idea is to go to see, to inspect. It's in the present tense. It's talking about a practice or a habit. To look on in order to help or to benefit, to have care for. See, it's not just a social call. And this word, if you look at this word and you look at the three words used in the Bible to describe shepherds, if you looked at one of those three words and you looked at this word, boy, it looks real similar. Because that's what we're doing when we're visiting. From a biblical perspective, we're caring for, we're looking after and inspecting to become more familiar with the needs, because when we become aware of the needs, what are we supposed to be doing? Taking care, addressing the needs as effectively as we possibly can. Now, what have we done in the church in regard to caring for the fatherless or the orphans? What have we done? Oh, we have children's homes all over the place, don't we? Not only in this country. Now, I'm more familiar with east of the Mississippi. Midwestern Children's Home is on the north end of Cincinnati, Ohio. Tennessee Children's Home, they have 4 campuses in Tennessee. They have one in East Tennessee, one in West Tennessee, and they have more in Middle Tennessee. There's North Alabama Children's Home. We have children's homes in foreign countries. That's one of the things that our missionaries do sometimes that is very effective, is we minister to children in need, children who are vulnerable and are in a jeopardized situation. We're caring for them. Now, what was the other object of visit? Widows. Okay, what have we done in the church that is anywhere near to the degree that we've done with the fatherless, the children at risk? Okay, we have a few nursing homes. But those nursing homes are not just for the widowed. They're for anybody who's older. And remember, the average age of a female when she's first widowed is 57. The typical length of time, the average length of time that a woman is widowed in our country is 14 years. So, Charles, your mother was 12, you said. The average is like 14. See, I think maybe something's fallen through the cracks here. But I have to admit, I didn't understand the need. 1 Timothy chapter 5, the longest passage in the Bible that I'm aware of that has to do with this subject, and we'll close this session by looking at this. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, I don't know how many times as a young preacher or a middle-aged preacher or a nearly senior citizen preacher, I quoted 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I quoted that passage on numerous occasions to encourage men, especially, to not be lazy and get out there and get a job and support adequately their wife and their children. I think that is an appropriate secondary application. But have you ever looked at the context? If you look at verse 8 and the verses previous to verse 8, And then you look at verse 8 and the verses following verse 8. What is that passage talking about? Widows. Widows. Pick up at verse 3. Honor widows who are really widows. I'm reading from the New King James Version. Honor, and the idea there, it's in the present tense, and the Greek language or idea of that word is care for. Honor or care for widows who are really widows. By the way, the word widow in the Greek language, Linsky, in his Greek work, in some of his Greek works, in regard to that word translated widow in the English language, the idea of that word is robbed. Widowed people have been robbed. You've been fleeced. You've been robbed. W.E. Vine points out that that word can also indicate forsaken. You've been forsaken. There's a lady that Cheryl Wayne and I met in Titusville, Florida, who communicated to me that after her husband passed away, there were times in her shower that she would beat the walls of the shower, screaming, "Why did you leave me?" That's raw grief. Robbed or forsaken. So notice in verse 4, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Who's the first line of ministry to the widow? The family. Not the church, the family. It's not unlike with the youth. Who is supposed to be raising the youth? Parents. Now, we in the church supplement those efforts and try in every way we can to help those parents. We have youth ministries, don't we? And we make it a point of trying to do everything we can to encourage those families and to help them with their youth. Do we do that about the widowed? I failed my mother. I didn't realize I was failing my mother. Before my father passed away, I told him, "Dad, I know you're worried about Mom." I said, if this ends in you dying, it'll be glory for you. If you live, it'll be grace. If you die, it'll be glory. I promise you I'll make sure that Mom's taken care of. So after his passing, I made it a point that if she needed help with finances and figuring things out, I would help her. If she needed a ride to the doctor, I would help her. I was most proud of the fact that her yard was the best looking yard in her neighborhood. I used to be a control freak. I'm now a recovering control freak. I used to be OCD. I'm borderline OCD. And that's especially true when it came to grass cutting. I did not realize that what she needed most, I did not give to her like I should have. We were sitting in a rehab unit one day in her room after her rehab. I'm the second of 4 boys. We were there by ourselves, and she says out of the blue, "I wish I'd had a daughter." I was sitting there in stone silence after that, and my internal response to that was, "Mom, what am I? Chopped liver? I'm here." I didn't say a word, though. There were a few moments of silence, and then something came to me. And I sincerely said this. I said, "Mom, I wish you'd had a daughter too." I knew what she meant. You women, you're better human beings. Okay, I said it. It's now been live streamed. It's available for everybody to hear. Now, you got to remember, I had a wife for 41 years, 3 daughters. 4 of my 5 grandchildren are female. I suffer from what I call overdose of the female gender, okay? I can't be normal. I can't be a regular guy. I have this affliction about me. Women are just the better gender. I thank you for putting up with us. But seriously, you are gifted by God, naturally, to be more nurturing. You value relationships more. You are better at relationships. Now, us guys can be, but it's really hard. I mean, we have to really go to school about this stuff and learn a lot of things and implement a lot of new things in our life to be the creative and fully active and effective participants in human relationships. we struggle with it more than you women do. See, what my mom needed most wasn't her grass cut perfectly. I could have hired a teenager to have done that. What she needed most was me. She needed family. My 3 brothers weren't very attentive. As a matter of fact, one was in prison during this time. I understood what she meant. You know what the widowed parents and grandparents need most? They need their family. They need their family. And in that way, they are repaying their parents and their grandparents for the good they've done for them. Well, you have all this discussion leading up to verse 8. Drop down to verse 16. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. See, there are some widows that don't have family. And then there are widowed people that have family. Now, what have we done in the church to educate our families? See, that was my problem. I'd never been educated about how the family ought to effectively minister to the widowed parents and grandparents in the family. And so in my ignorance and in my inexperience, I did what I thought, what guys do. You try to fix stuff. You fill holes and you fix stuff. That's what you do. Well, now look at verse 8. This whole passage from verse 3 to verse 16 is about caring for the widowed. If anyone does not provide for his own what? His own widowed. Look at the context. The discussion is about the widowed in the family. But if anyone does not provide for his own widowed parents or grandparents, and especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Everything prior to verse 8 and after verse 8 is about ministering effectively to the widowed. I think one of the things that we need to do in the church is educate people about loss and life after loss, so that our families in the church can be great examples to everybody else of how to care for the widowed people in their families. And when we do that, we're glorifying God. W.E. Vine says in regard to this passage in 1 Timothy 5, there's an intimation, kind of a hint of a tendency to shelve individual responsibility at the expense of church funds. The same thing can happen with youth ministry. But we need to make sure that we don't let it happen to us. Even if you're inexperienced, you're not ignorant anymore. You know more now than you knew before. I wish I would have known more about this stuff. So what are we doing relative to ministering to the widowed? Dr. Seuss has not been canceled by the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. With that, we stop and take a break. Make sure you get up and stretch. Go to the restroom if you need to. There may be some calories still in that room over there, but we do need to get back, and we'll give you a holler when it's time to get back. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. Let's do it we'll do it at the start. We'll do this one. We'll do this one.